Hi, I'm Robert Trevino, Chief Conductor of the Malmo Symphony Orchestra. I am here with my good friend and our Associate Concertmaster, Håkon Rudner, who is going to join me for this canal conversation about this week's program of two Sjostakovitj piano concertos and Sibelius' Seventh Symphony. Thanks for joining me, Håkon.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So, we were talking a lot a few days ago about Sibelius. I want to start in an opposite direction than I usually do, which is in order. So we were discussing in particular something I think would be quite interesting for people to kind of get into a little bit. You know, Sibelius, we so often think of him as a composer who writes for really, really large orchestras. But it turns out that a lot of the premieres of his symphonies were written, were given by slightly smaller forces. And I don't have a lot of experience, pre-corona with doing Sibelius symphonies with slightly smaller orchestras. But we're discussing this. You've had quite a bit of experience of playing, well, all the symphonies like that. And do you feel that there's anything really different that comes out of that slightly smaller orchestra format for Sibelius?
Well, I do think that for funnily enough, the later symphonies, it works pretty well. Since I'm still playing in the Chamber Orchestra of Europe, and I have done since before I joined Malmö Symphony Orchestra, and we did them with Paavo Berglund, who was I think.
He's considered one of the great Sibelius.
Yeah, the one who understood the music the best, maybe in the world, because he was so close and had such close contacts with Sibelius' friends, and so he knew a lot. And we did Symphony Number 1 and 2. We did with an enlarged orchestra. We were like 14 first violins, and for number 5,
but that's still not that big.
No.
I mean, most modern orchestras nowadays play it with 16 first violins. I mean, it's really, really quite a bit. And maybe to people at home, maybe that doesn't sound like a big difference, but that's like the difference of driving, I don't know, a Mini Coupe and then driving an SUV. I mean, it's like a really, really very big difference in the size of the orchestra. And then you were saying number 5, what size orchestra did you use for that?
12 firsts.
12, yeah. A little bit closer to what we did when we did it here, 5 and 6.
Yeah.
And also number 2 we did also that way with me.
How did you feel about that?
Well, you know, one of the things that I get into trouble sometimes when I have this conversation with people, because we jokingly say, oh, I really like this big, warm, plush type of sounding orchestra. And it is very funny after 2 years now with the orchestra that sometimes they start conducting and all of a sudden it just becomes very thick, the sound, which I really like it. But sometimes the music requires a bit more delicateness, a little bit more transparency than that type of aesthetic and that approach. And what I appreciated about doing especially number 2, in this slightly smaller formation, was the balance between the woodwinds and the strings. The interplay seemed a little bit, not more chamber music-like, but a little bit more, everybody was on equal footing. The only difficulty comes when the brass come in, because in the Second Symphony, and the First Symphony, it's really very large brass, the way he writes for them. It's very monolithic. It's very big sounds. So one has to take a great deal of care with balancing that out. But in principle, I think that the music comes off slightly a bit clearer, in fact. I don't know if you thought that.
Yeah, I think it is clearer. And I think if the brass wants to, they can kill everyone else if they want to. Even if we are 16 or 18 first violins and huge strings, but we have a friendly brass, so they don't. I think it's clarity versus the big rounder sound, maybe that
sonority, weight, density of sound. Yeah, it's funny. You know, when we talk about things like this density, colors, and things, one of my friends who's a musicologist says that there's no such thing in music. It's just sound, and it always kind of catches me when I hear her voice in the back of my head saying, there is no density, there is no weight, there is no color. It is just sound and frequencies. But yet, I think when a person sits in a concert hall, especially one as good as the Mama Live, one can feel the impact of the music. And I think for sure when you're playing in the orchestra, we were talking about this with the what was it, with the Tchaikovsky, with sometimes when the brass were going nice and strong, and you're like, that's really nice, especially in the march section. There is sound impact of the sound. And of course, nowadays, people have gotten used to being at home, listening to things through their computers. Even if they have an incredible, the best sound system in the world, you don't quite get it the same way when you come in live. And I think that will be, I'm willing to bet people are missing that. Would you think so?
Absolutely.
As well?
Nothing can beat listening to music live.
Yeah.
I really think so.
Something in your body changes, don't you think? I mean, sometimes I walk out of a concert hall and I feel like somehow somebody had my cells, my skin, my blood seems different. I don't know how to explain it. The way I breathe.
I guess it's also the experience of going there for that special occasion. You can set it up like that at home maybe if you have a fantastic stereo, but it will never be the same. It's like going to the cinema instead of watching a movie at home, I think.
Yeah, exactly. But thinking about cinema and this idea, because in the Seventh Symphony of Sibelius, I think it is kind of interesting. It's a symphony in one movement, in a way. I mean, it just goes continuous. But he has all the typical components of a symphony. He's got the first movement, the scherzo, the slow movement, and the finale. But it's merged together. It's as if you took 4 sticks of butter and then put it up on high heat and then reconstituted it and put it back in the refrigerator. It becomes one glob, but it used to be 4 bits. And I don't know, how does that feel playing a piece that is melded together that much? I mean, as a musician inside the orchestra, trying to navigate that and know your place in that. I mean, it's not a very big house, the Seventh Symphony. I mean, it's in many ways, it's the smallest from a time standpoint. It's the smallest from the orchestra standpoint. And it's the most lean in a way. And yet I find it is unbelievably complicated and very, very, very wild terrain that you have to travel. How does that feel being inside of an orchestra while you're trying to deal with that?
You know, Seventh Symphony was always something special to me. When I first played it, I didn't realize that he actually lived for many years after writing it. I thought it was his testament to the world, telling about his good and bad things in life and all that. And then I learned that he lived for, 30 years after, but he didn't write that much after. So maybe it was. I think there is something to that.
You know, he has a huge parallel with Brahms in that way. I mean, Brahms was a composer who did most of all of his work young and middle age. And then there was a whole long period of time he didn't do anything again. Strauss is another one like that. I mean, but in Sibelius' case, he achieved worldwide recognition and fame. I mean, not early on, but I mean, most composers become famous after they die, right? But he lived through his fame. I mean, he even got to enjoy it and use it in many ways. We were talking about that a few weeks ago when we did Rautavaara, that Sibelius was responsible partially for Rautavaara being able to study in the United States. But yet he hadn't written anything. Do you have any reason to understand why that might have been, or do you just...
No, I don't know that he had some condition of any sort, but I feel somehow that the first bar or so is like it's syncopated, which could suggest that it is a heartbeat involved, and then it ends like a little cramp or so. So maybe some pre-heart attack or a small heart attack of some sort, and then I assume that he's going in another world. Like you say that before you die, you go through your whole life, and I see it this way, that he's seeing his whole life like this, and he's going here a little bit and then moving to another area of his life, and then to a third, and then that would also explain the transitions, the accelerandos, and ritenutos between and the moving bit, and then at the end he's back and dies. That's what I think.
I remember the first time I heard the symphony, I thought it was music of a very sad man. And da-da-dee-da-dee with the flutes, that moment always just yanks my heart out. And it's amazing because, you know, in one way, we musicians who spend our lives studying this stuff and spending our lives in this type of music, we eventually learn information that kind of tells us whether it's the right story or not the right story. And yet, this impression that you have of the first time you engaged with this music, not knowing what ended up happening, I think somehow is absolutely right at the same time. And I think that that's also one of the great things about music, is that it doesn't have a defined story. It is what we see in it. I mean, it is always going to be what it is. The same notes of Sibelius 7th Symphony will not be changed unless somebody goes in there and messes with it. But it is already what it is. And it comes back to that comment from my friend who said that music is only sound. Music is music. And Sibelius 7th Symphony is Sibelius 7th Symphony. And what it means is more like a mirror to us. And I think that that's a very, that speaks to the greatness of the piece, I think. On another point, in a completely different direction, we have the other music of the program, Sjostakovitj 2 piano concertos. The second concerto, they're both separated by a lot of time. I mean, the first concerto was a young Sjostakovitj. And as you were talking about going back in Sibelius and in the case of sort of having a flashback of your life and seeing different scenes, I think in cinematic terms, that you're ebbing and flowing between different scenes. And the first piano concerto is music for the movie theater. I mean, Sjostakovitj, I don't know if you know this, but he earned a lot of money, not a lot of money. He earned money initially as a young guy, a young composer, playing in silent films. And you would old Charlie Chaplin and things like that with no music, and he would just improvise on the piano. And he was known as a wicked improviser. I mean, he could just sit down at the piano, and he had this sort of nervousness about his improvisations. He could never improvise anything slow. It always had to be very fast. And that's the funny thing about this first concerto, because it doesn't really have any slow bits in it. It's all kind of very young, virtuosic, hyper-sarcastic, hyper-critical, and very funny, fast, Charlie Chaplin-esque music. You like those films, I think. We were discussing Charlie Chaplin.
Very much.
And it's interesting that people don't often think about cinema's impact on music. I mean, we do nowadays when we think about John Williams and things like that. But with composers like Sjostakovitj, or even Brahms, who wasn't writing music for films, playing piano for films, he was doing it for shows in Vienna. I think that there's somehow that we start to feel in this period of life in Sjostakovitj, the common life starting to infiltrate the Western high art music. And yet that tradition had already been started much earlier with other composers. But I find this music to be just, I keep coming back to the word cinematic because that's absolutely what it is.
It's very entertaining, certainly.
It's entertaining. It's absurd music in a way. And fortunately, we get to, you were mentioning our very friendly brass section. And the first piano concerto has a very virtuosic solo trumpet part played by Gustav, our solo trumpet player. And it sounds like music for one of those old black and white Western movies where you see people charging off towards the stereotypical Indians and going through the pueblos in America and stuff like that. It's just silly music. Have you ever played them before?
I played the trumpet and piano concerto, not the other one.
Yeah. Do you remember much of it?
Not really.
It probably goes
but
by
it was
too fast.
it was lightweight music in one way, but good fun to play, I think. Yeah,
you wouldn't normally associate Sjostakovitj with lightweight music, though, would you? I mean, for most of your engagement, it's mostly like Fifth Symphony, 10th Symphony, death and revolutions and anarchy. You know,
dark sarcasm, and this is funny sarcasm, maybe more.
Yeah, exactly. And the second piano concerto is a completely different creature. I mean, this was written for his son, Maxim Sjostakovitj, much, much later. And, actually, Julia and I played, my wife, we played this together quite some years ago now, I think 8 years ago. And I remember also speaking to a good friend of mine, a well-known pianist, who we were discussing that Shostakovich's second piano concerto is often considered kind of a kid's piece because it was written for a child. But yet it's technically really, really very difficult. It's actually really tricky for the orchestra as well. This mixed meter in the last movement, this uneven bars. I remember the first time I ever heard the symphony, it was with a very, very famous conductor, extremely famous pianist, and a very, very, very famous orchestra. And they were going through the last movement, and it completely went backwards. I mean, the soloist got off, the conductor started conducting the wrong meter, and the orchestra went in the opposite direction. So it's kind of, even though it's a kid's piece written for a young person, it's very difficult music. It's really very, very hard music. But I think in one way, it's very interesting to see this music because I don't know. I keep thinking about Sibelius, going back to Sibelius, and we were talking about the Seventh Symphony and how you felt like it was very clear about this sort of going back in time and looking through one's life. But part of doing that means to go back to the beginning as well. And to maybe look at the earlier part. And one can smell in the Seventh Symphony of Sibelius the early symphonies and the later one, and the progression. And I think in this way, in the Shostakovich two piano concertos, which they're not really big pieces, they're short, not massive orchestras, but they also are bookend pieces, another way of seeing a composer and how they have changed. And I think it's an interesting sort of project to see that development, not only in a symphony, but also within these concertos for a composer. Yeah. Great music, though.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic music. Well, thanks, Hakan, for joining me. And please join us this Thursday for the two Shostakovich piano concertos and Sibelius 7th Symphony.